As Robbie said, I'm a second-year PhD student at the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, and my research is on the topic of incels and who they are. So, who are the incels? Basically, as you will see from the title of my research project, that's actually what I'm trying to find out. But to start off, for now, let's start with a very brief and general overview. And so the term incel itself, which stands for involuntary celibate, was coined by a young trans woman who 20, 30 years ago wanted to create a community for people who felt left out of romantic and sexual relationships, and that wanted to be a supportive community, but what it has now turned into is more a misogynist, women-hating and anti-feminist subsection of the manosphere. And the trans woman who created this term does not want to be associated with it anymore whatsoever. That's why I'm not naming her as well. So, and one of the key aspects of the incel community is that they operate mainly online, and their community moved from platforms like Reddit and 4chan to their own website fora, and they blame their lack of sexual and romantic relationship on women's sexual freedom and agency, and on feminism in general. When I wrote my proposal for my PhD project, there was only a couple of publications, but now there's a big wealth of linguistic research on the incels, so I feel very lucky to be able to draw on that. So I collected my data with the help of my very supportive and extremely patient colleague Mitchell Abrams, who wrote the Python script for the data scraping. And over a period of 3 to 4 days, we ran the script and basically scraped the whole subforum inceldom discussion from the forum website incels.is. And we ended up with a sizable corpus of over 165,000 threads, consisting of more than 4 million posts. This is the website, and this is the subforum I took my data from. The little that I have told you about the incels, you might want to ask, why do you want to do that, though? And here's a very good reason. That's a quote of somebody who considers themselves a former incel and who spoke very openly about their experience within that community, and especially the last bit about getting sucked into an echo chamber of hate really caught my attention. And from my initial data exploration in the forums, I could see that extremely young men are part of these communities, and a lot of the knowledge about women, about the relationships between men and women and people in general, they take that from there, and that's something that I found worth investigating. So that's my research project. But what I want to focus on today is what I have done so far and what I am planning to do in terms of corpus research. So obviously underlying all this is the idea of computer-mediated communication, that in its most basic form it describes all kinds of human interaction via the different digital devices that we have nowadays, so such as laptops, tablets, smartphones, and smartwatches. And it has generated a variety of new genres, such as WhatsApp messages, emails, but also forum posts, like in my data. And while this is a great opportunity for linguistic research, via having access to big online corpora or being able to scrape whole fora like I did, the main reason why this is important to me is the function of online fora as so-called echo chambers of hate and places of potential radicalization and recruitment, and this connection to collective identity construction. So basically the frameworks and methodologies underlying my research are deeply rooted in post-structuralist and postmodernist ideas of identity as a product of dominant discourse tied to institutional practices, and identity as a performance. The first bit that I have done and based my first case study on was a critical discourse analysis of 10 threads that I had selected, undertaken a thematic analysis, and the preliminary findings that will feed into my corpus research. First of all, a couple of words on identity construction. While formerly identity itself was seen as something pre-existing and stable, the postmodernist shift with Foucault and Derrida has shifted the idea of identity as something more performative, unstable, and most importantly, socially constructed. And while Derrida focused on the oppressive nature of language through which meaning is constructed around binary oppositions that are ranked in hierarchies, there's also a big wealth of linguistic studies on construction of identity and its linguistic representation, and that includes national identity, gender identity, or professional identity. So I will very, very briefly just go through the themes that I have isolated in my first thematic analysis. So the three big themes that I found was essentialized differences, and under that sub-theme there's first there's a certain hierarchy of masculinities that is described in, or that I could find in my data, and there's a code cluster forming this sub-theme around hierarchies that go something like gay men, incels, normies, chat lights, chats, and gigachats, and that is especially interesting because later in my work I wanted to include the idea of masculinities seen through Cornell and Messerschmitt's idea of hegemonic masculinities. The other sub-theme is how the incels see women, and in this small data set that I used, I could find, like, there was a persistent use of the term foid, which is short for female humanoid, so that indicates that they dispute or rather deny women humanity altogether, and it also shows that they have a view of women as this one homogeneous group, while the hierarchies between the masculinities suggest that there's a diversity of masculine identities that are possible. The justifications for their misogyny could roughly be divided into three sub-themes. One of them I call tit for tat or revenge, because a lot of the arguments is they denied us access to the resource of sexuality and romantic relationships, and that's why it is valid for us to hate them. The second one is quite interesting because it shows a lot of the underlying black pill ideology around what they call hypergamy, which is basically the idea of female privilege, that the world and society as a whole is centered around the needs of women and caters towards women and their success. And the third one was an interesting one because it also underlines how important this echo chamber seems to be in their ideas on women and feminism, because it was almost seen as an inevitability. You'd have to be you have to hate women if you understand how the black pill works, how the world works. And there was one in particular that struck me, one quote that said, "I didn't really hate women in high school. They were never really mean, but once black-pilled, I couldn't see them the same way, and I had to hate them." And this tendency is particularly worrying in combination with what I said, that there's a lot of very young men on there. The third overall theme that I found was one around rejecting any type of diversity based on their very essentialist and biological essentialist view of gender, but that definitely needs more data to be of any useful help in further research. So, and now this is a screenshot of one of the first posts that I saw and wanted to keep for myself, to remind myself to really not get sucked into this and not just get upset about what I read and make up my mind along these lines, but really scrutinize what I read and try to view it through an academic lens. And that's where the next step of my work comes in. So what do I want to do next? The answer for my project is Corpus Linguistics. So there's two aspects to the next step, and one of them is looking into inclusivity, and the next one would be looking into incel terminology and specifically self-labeling. And again, the question, who is we? My plan is to search all occurrences of we, our, and later maybe they, them, in the corpus that I have collected, and see which patterns of inclusivity and referential patterns do come up, and then use Joanne Scheibman's idea of exclusive and inclusive we pronouns to analyze this. So to see what are the different pragmatic functions of the pronoun use we in the forum, and then use the model of hegemonic masculinity that I mentioned earlier, suggested by Messerschmitt and Kuhnel, to analyze this. And so basically one could say hegemonic masculinity is in some contexts refers to man's engagement in toxic practices, but also as it has numerous configurations, this could also include distancing oneself from such toxicity when it is advantageous. And the performances of hegemonic masculinity serves to maintain a dominant position for men by subordinating women. But the thing that makes it very interesting, especially for my research, is the idea, the underlying fundamental ideal of hegemonic masculinity is that there is a presumed entitlement to heterosexual sex, with women perceived as the sexual objects and the objects of conquest. So, and prior academic research on incels also demonstrates that the extreme responses and failures to achieve that, these perceived normative standards, and that makes the reference to this very stable concept even to those who don't have access to the resource. By the way, resource is their own terminology. I obviously don't agree with that. So yes, this is just a screenshot of one of the first corpus searches that I did for we, and some of the examples that I have found that show how varied and different the incels use we in their forum. And I found particularly interesting the second and the third one, where they specified themselves that we uglies are meant to be shat on. We incels should all join forces and start a pilgrimage to see our Lord and Savior, by which they mean one of the people who actually put their words into action and committed one of the so-called gender-based terrorism attacks and killed a number of people. And there's quite a number of those in the last 10, 15 years. So it's not only an online movement anymore. I'll give you a second to read through the examples. And there's another one that that really links back to one of the other themes that I found, is stop the nonsense that we ethnics are stealing your women. This is a very good example for a use of we in the forum, where it doesn't mean we incels, but we ethnics. But yes, that obviously it's very much early stages of research in progress here. And then the next step would be looking at incel terminology. So I attempt to look at keenness, and possible corpora for comparison would be the BNC, but also Mumsnet, as Mumsnet. First of all, the data is already in our institute, so that makes it much, much easier to use the data and compare it. But also we are looking at places that are potentially same-sex places of communication around a certain topic that is shared. And then safe labeling, and as we've heard earlier from Michaela Malberg, that labels in general are the way that people tell us something about how people understand the world, and that's why I find this is a useful contribution to my research project. But before I finish, I want to add a quick note on queer linguistics and why I want to use that as an important part of my research rather than just a lens. Because I stand firmly with Mochenbacher, Stego, and Lieb on this, that not only do I not think that queer linguistics is something that just looks at the queers, but it's a much more needed and much more useful lens to look at analyzing heterosexual identities and their construction through discourse. So I hope that by the end of my project we will have some things to look at that do not only say something about the incel community, but also can be translated into wider society, and how the ideas surrounding this sub-community have spread and leaked into everyday discourse as well. So these are my references, which are ridiculously small, so you can probably not read them, so please do get in touch if you want the reference list. And thank you very much for listening. And please do get in touch if you have any questions, suggestions, or comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Natascha. We're about to take a break, but we'll take a question from the room if there is one. Yes?
Thank you, Natascha, for a very interesting talk. You answered half of my question, because I was interested in knowing how does this echo chamber, which is clearly all online, how does it pertains to like violence against women, like gendered violence, which is done especially for the fact that these people that are killed are women. So do you know, I know that this is very much a work in progress and you're still not finishing your PhD yet, but do you know if there's like a divide in the community, or if they all agree with translating their online hate into practice, for lack of a better word?
Well, I do think that there's a massive tendency of that, and that makes me, every time I read it, it really makes me extremely angry. There's a lot of what almost is like role-playing of exchanging all of these extremely violent fantasies about rape, about how women and also sexually active and thus successful men should be punished. But you can also see how it leaks into other spaces. So when I'm using the internet for other things and on social media, where I come across things that remind me so much of the stuff that I read in these incel forums, I do genuinely think that there is a massive danger, not only in terms of will people go out and commit lots of rapes, but also in how it translates to treating women, how to treat women online. And there's a lot of exchanges on ideas of how you can what they call chatfish women on dating websites such as Tinder by pretending to be what they consider one of the chads, a very good looking successful man, and how to cause harm by that. And they share details of young women and their social media handles in their fora. So I think it's not a danger, I think it's already happening a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Natascha.
Thank you.